Women's suffrage is the right of women to vote in elections. Limited voting rights were gained by women in Finland, Iceland, Sweden and some Western U.S.states in the late 19th century. National and international organizations formed to coordinate efforts to gain voting rights, especially the International Woman Suffrage Alliance, and also worked for equal civil rights for women. In 1881, the Isle of Man enacted the Manx Election Act, which gave women who owned property the right to vote in the country's parliament, Tynwald. In 1893, New Zealand, then a self-governing British colony, granted adult women the right to vote. The self-governing colony of South Australia, now an Australian state, did the same in 1894, and women were able to vote in the next election, which was held in 1895. South Australia also permitted women to stand for election alongside men. In 1901, the 6 British colonies of Australia federated to become the Commonwealth of Australia, and women acquired the right to vote and stand in federal elections from 1902. But discriminatory restrictions against Aboriginal women voting in national elections were not completely removed until 1962. The first European country to introduce women's suffrage was the Grand Duchy of Finland, then part of the Russian Empire, which elected the world's first women members of parliament in the 1907 parliamentary elections. Norway followed, granting full women's suffrage in 1913. Most European, Asian and African countries did not pass women's suffrage until after World War I. Late adopters in Europe were Spain in 1931, France in 1944, Italy in 1946, Greece in 1952, San Marino in 1959, Monaco in 1962, Andorra in 1970, and Liechtenstein in 1984. In addition, although women in Portugal obtained suffrage in 1931, this was with stronger restrictions than those of men. Full gender equality in voting was only granted in 1976. And although women in Switzerland could vote at federal level since 1971, full gender equality at all local level elections was achieved only in 1991, when the last holdout canton of Appenzell-Innerrhoden finally allowed women the right to vote. Canada, the United States and a few Latin American nations passed women's suffrage before World War II, while the vast majority of Latin American nations established women's suffrage in the 1940s. The last Latin American country to give women the right to vote was Paraguay in 1961. In December 2015, women were first allowed to vote in Saudi Arabia. Extended political campaigns by women and their supporters have generally been necessary to gain legislation or constitutional amendments for women's suffrage. In many countries, limited suffrage for women was granted before universal suffrage for men. For instance, literate women or property owners were granted suffrage before all men received it. The United Nations encouraged women's suffrage in the years following World War II, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women identifies it as a basic right, with 189 countries currently being parties to this convention. History. In young Athenian democracy, often cited as the birthplace of democracy, only men were permitted to vote. Through subsequent centuries, Europe was generally ruled by monarchs, though various forms of parliament arose at different times. The high rank ascribed to abbesses within the Catholic Church permitted some women the right to sit and vote at national assemblies, as with various high-ranking abbesses in medieval Germany, who were ranked among the independent princes of the empire. The Protestant successors enjoyed the same privilege almost into modern times. Marie Guyot, a French nun who worked with the First Nations peoples of Canada during the 17th century, wrote in 1654 regarding the suffrage practices of Iroquois women, "These female chieftains are women of standing amongst the savages, and they have a deciding vote in the councils. They make decisions that like the men, and it is they who even delegated the first ambassadors to discuss peace." The Iroquois, like many First Nations peoples in North America, had a matrilineal kinship system. Property and descent were passed through the female line. Women elders voted on hereditary male chiefs and could depose them. The emergence of modern democracy generally began with male citizens obtaining the right to vote in advance of female citizens, except in the Kingdom of Hawaii, where universal manhood and women's suffrage was introduced in 1840. However, a constitutional amendment in 1852 rescinded female voting and put property qualifications on male voting. In Sweden, conditional women's suffrage was in effect during the Age of Liberty. Other possible contenders for first country to grant women suffrage include the Corsican Republic, the Pitcairn Islands, the Isle of Man, and Franceville, but some of these operated only briefly as independent states and others were not clearly independent. In 1756, Lydia Taft became the first legal woman voter in colonial America. This occurred under British rule in the Massachusetts colony. In a New England town meeting in Uxbridge, Massachusetts, she voted on at least 3 occasions. Unmarried women who owned property could vote in New Jersey from 1776 to 1807. In the 1792 elections in Sierra Leone, then a new British colony, all heads of household could vote and 1/3 were ethnic African women. The female descendants of the Bounty mutineers who lived on Pitcairn Islands could vote from 1838. This right was transferred after they resettled, in 1856, to Norfolk Island. The seed for the first women's rights convention in the United States in Seneca Falls, New York was planted in 1840, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. The conference refused to seat Mott and other women delegates from the U.S. because of the sex. In 1851, Stanton met temperance worker Susan B. Anthony, and shortly the two would be joined in the long struggle to secure the vote for women in the U.S. In 1868, Anthony encouraged working women from the printing and sewing trades in New York, who were excluded from men's trade unions, to form working women's associations. As a delegate to the National Labor Congress in 1868, Anthony persuaded the Committee on Female Labor to call for votes for women and equal pay for equal work. The men at the conference deleted the reference to the vote. In the U.S., women in the Wyoming Territory could vote as of 1869. In 1881, the Isle of Man, an internally self-governing dependent territory of the British Crown, enfranchised women property owners. With this it provided the first action for women's suffrage within the British Isles. The Pacific colony of Franceville, declaring independence in 1889, became the first self-governing nation to adopt universal suffrage without distinction of sex or color. Of currently existing independent countries, New Zealand was the first to acknowledge women's right to vote in 1893 when it was a self-governing British colony. Unrestricted women's suffrage in terms of voting rights was adopted in New Zealand in 1893. Following a successful movement led by Kate Shepherd, the Women's Suffrage Bill was adopted weeks before the general election of that year. The women of the British Protectorate of Cook Islands obtained the same rights soon after and beat New Zealand's women to the polls in 1893. The self-governing British colony of South Australia enacted universal suffrage in 1895, also allowing women to stand for the colonial parliament that year. The Commonwealth of Australia federated in 1901, with women voting and standing for office in some states. The Australian Federal Parliament extended voting rights to all adult women for federal elections from 1902. The first European country to introduce women's suffrage was the Grand Duchy of Finland in 1906. It was among reforms passed following the 1905 uprising. As a result of the 1907 parliamentary elections, Finland's voters elected 19 women as the first female members of a representative parliament. They took their seats later that year. In the years before World War I, women in Norway also won the right to vote, as did women in the remaining Australian states. Denmark granted women's suffrage in 1915. Near the end of the war, Canada, Russia, Germany, and Poland also recognized women's right to vote. Propertied British women over 30 had the vote in 1918, Dutch women in 1919, and American women won the vote on the 26th of August 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Irish women won the same voting rights as men in the Irish Free State Constitution, 1922. In 1928, British women won suffrage on the same terms as men, that is, for persons 21 years old and older. Suffrage of Turkish women introduced in 1930 for local elections and in 1934 for national elections. By the time French women were granted the suffrage in July 1944 by Charles de Gaulle's government in exile, France had been for about a decade the only Western country that did not at least allow women's suffrage at municipal elections. Voting rights for women were introduced into international law by the United Nations Human Rights Commission, whose elected chair was Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 21 stated, "Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures." The United Nations General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Political Rights of Women, which went into force in 1954, enshrining the equal rights of women to vote, hold office, and access public services as set out by national laws. One of the most recent jurisdictions to acknowledge women's full right to vote was Bhutan in 2008. Suffrage movements. The suffrage movement was a broad one, encompassing women and men with a wide range of views. In terms of diversity, the greatest achievement of the 20th century woman suffrage movement was its extremely broad class base. One major division, especially in Britain, was between suffragists, who sought to create change constitutionally, and suffragettes, led by English political activist Emmeline Pankhurst, who in 1903 formed the more militant Women's Social and Political Union. Pankhurst would not be satisfied with anything but action on the question of women's enfranchisement with deeds, not words, the organization's motto. There was also a diversity of views on a woman's place. Suffragist themes often included the notions that women were naturally kinder and more concerned about children and the elderly. As Creditor shows, it was often assumed that women voters would have a civilizing effect on politics, opposing domestic violence, liquor, and emphasizing cleanliness and community. An opposing theme, Creditor argues, held that he had the same moral standards. They should be equal in every way and that there was no such thing as a woman's natural role. For black women, achieving suffrage was a way to counter the disfranchisement of the men of the race. Despite this discouragement, black suffragists continued to insist on their equal political rights. Starting in the 1890s, African American women began to assert the political rights aggressively from within their own clubs and suffrage societies. If white American women, with all the natural and acquired advantages, need the ballot, argued Adela Hunt Logan of Tuskegee, Alabama, how much more do black Americans, male and female, need the strong defense of a vote to help secure the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Timeline.